I'm awfully happy, and I think I can say that I have an honor to present you our guest for today, Eva von Redecker. Eva works at the chair for practical philosophy, social philosophy, and the philosophy of law with Professor Rachel Jegi at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. She's the associate member at the Center for Transdisciplinary Gender Studies at Humboldt University and the founding member and the co-chair of SWIP, Society for Women in Philosophy, which I find at least very exciting and important to mention. Eva's primary topics include history, revolution and social change, social theory, gender and sexuality, feminist utopias and relationalities, property and propertization, and I think very much in tune with what the Group for Social Engagement Study does, all of those topics. She has authored and edited books on Hannah Arendt and Judith Butler. I will mention the two of them. Gravitation zum Guten, Hannah Arendts Moralphilosophie, and Zur Aktualität von Judith Butler, eine Anleitung in ihr Werk. She has also worked closely with Raymond Goyce, who was also our dear guest this year. And as I mentioned already, the Group for Social Engagement Studies, because most of the members are here, her today's lecture will combine her various interests, obviously, and is very much in line with what we do. So without further ado, I would only mention the title of the lecture, Exodus by Dispossession, Butler and Landauer on Fundamental Collectivity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and also all of you for collectively hosting me here and lending me your attention on such a nice sunny afternoon. I know that's not always an easy decision to take, so thanks a lot in advance. When I try to decide what to bring here, then I thought I want to focus it on something that is in communication or exchange with the article by Adriana, which I read on community of the dispossessed. And so the core of my paper is two accounts of theoretical accounts of dispossession of the sovereign individual and the idea of sort of unearthing a more collective structure on a more fundamental level of individuality, which would allow for community building. And one of those descriptions is, I think, one you're familiar with, and Adriana is an expert on herself, is Judith Butler's. And the other one is perhaps far less familiar, that's Gustav Landauer's, and I'm going to say a bit more about who he is. He's a sort of very marginal German Jewish anarchist at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And I can't go into all the details on which there is also even a secret communication between those two positions, because Butler started her whole infatuation with philosophy started with her reading Martin Buber, and Martin Buber was a sort of disciple of Landauer and a great sort of fan and admirer of Landauer. So there's even sort of a line of identity, transmission of a certain type of German Jewish intellectual tradition. But that, what I'm interested in here is a sort of systematic point about the dispossession of the individual. However, around those two conceptions that I bring and unpack in a bit more detail, I've now managed to cheat and fit in a bit all my current intellectual interests and topics and concerns. And so, because as I announced it, and that's definitely what carries most part of the lecture, I'm placing those moments of dispossession and community building in the sort of trajectory of a certain understanding of social change and revolution. And that's sort of an idea of slow, processual, interstitial social change or revolution. That's something that I'm sort of interested in, and that is actually also an interest partly sparked by reading Landauer's work, not on dispossessing the individual, but Landauer's work on revolution and social change. So in some sense, I'm gonna put a lot more weight on those little utopian moments of dispossession and community founding, and the sort of hope of making them steps in some kind of alternative vision of revolution. However, at the end, and I don't know, like you obviously have to interrupt me after 45 minutes, so I don't know whether we get to the end. I also have a loop of reflecting on this very concept of dispossession and why, and I kind of want to bring forward an idea that it's not coincidence that we're talking in a like metaphoric of property here. And so to understand the structures or the paradigm we're in, which partly is responsible for the fact that founding communities of solidarity is so hard, I think has something to do with the way in which a certain property logics has infused and deflected lots of social structures. So that's a sort of kind of reification theory of property or propertization. And then in the end, I'm going to argue that we don't only need dispossession, we also need depropertization. So that's if I get there, otherwise you can ask me in the bar. And I terribly like talking fast, so just interrupt me and shout if it's not like clear. So in her analysis of left melancholia, Wendy Brown describes how many left or Marxist theoreticians cling to outlived concepts in a way that makes them prone to harbor resentment and denial of reality. And I think that remains true even if we don't have left melancholia, but a certain kind of left research and mania at the moment in some circles. I think it will only be productive if it's not done either melancholically or maniacally, sort of clinging to lost concepts, but sort of reworking them. I mean, as any historical materialist would know one has to do. So those, what Brown describes as left melancholics, would rather lose touch, and that might be all of us, of course, would rather lose touch with the present than abandon the future that a particular theoretical tool could promise. As a cure for this syndrome, Brown demands an intellectual labor of mourning with a particular focus on the concept of revolution. And her hope is that that would allow us to parse or pick apart the concept of revolution and decide what aspects of its heritage need to be given up and what can be reclaimed. Brown, for her part, expects at least a recovery of what she calls the Utopian Horizon from this exercise, but with a crucial limitation, namely to recuperate a utopian imaginary in the absence of a revolutionary mechanism for its realization, unquote. To contend with a situation in which we possess a horizon for radical change, but no means to implement it, nevertheless seems questionable to me. Perhaps in her opposition between utopian horizon and revolutionary mechanism, Brown doesn't capture this full spectrum of our options. The optimistic claim that we can reconsider the notion of revolution in a way which delivers it both from the grip of a dogmatic philosophy of history and a martial or even apocalyptic imagery of the event, it's of course one of the other fashionable ways at the moment to theorize revolution, provides the background for my considerations here. And I want to unpack a bit this claim about a different way of sort of mourning and rebuilding revolution by referring back to a sort of very narrow, partly you could label it Jewish anarchist theoretical lineage. Another label for it would be the Exodus notion of revolution, and that rejects both this sort of apocalyptic note of revolution as singular event, but even the sort of messianism that at least some interpreters of Benjamin see at play in his notion of revolution, and proposes a processual understanding of radical change which sets out from small utopian alternatives. So Walter is, for example, someone who has written about it. And in some sense, I think this opposition between anarchist and Marxist notion of revolution is somewhat misleading here and comes from the historical context in which people like, for example, Landauer developed their thinking, because he was writing against the Marxism that, like we now, the Western Marxists always call it the vulgar Marxism. I don't know if that's a fortunate choice, but this sort of scientific dogmatic Marxism that had a formulation of laws of history analogous to laws of nature. And I mean, that's obviously like not the necessary interpretation of historical materialism, but that was the kind of framework against which those anarchists worked, and therefore I think they overstated the opposition. I think actually one can sort of reconstruct. Marx is somebody who thought about revolution in very processual terms, like you need a long like germinating of the processes which need to be there before you have the actual event. I mean, alles im Schoße der alten Gesellschaft. So, how do you even say that? Anyway, so there is of course no abrupt change in Marx either. But in a Marxist notion of revolution, you somehow have usually some version or other of explaining away the problem of transition, because the idea is that if we change the mode of production, then the rest will fall in place as well. I mean, in the more radical sort of formulations that people use against Marx, it's like when he says there will be no politics anymore after the revolution. But however we read it, there is at least, if not an economism, then a sort of centering on the change of the forces of production, and not so much of a consideration whether really all of everyday life social practices will follow suit. And the way that sort of a lot of socialist revolutions have rather spectacularly failed and sort of reinstated certain authoritarianisms, I think gives some credibility to the worries that a lot of anarchists even had already during the 19th century, that there's a very hard task in sort of restructuring all of our everyday patterns of behavior. And I think in an interesting way that communicates with what we today somewhat clumsily always talk about and sort of debates about intersectionality, where it's like there's not one core contradiction, but there are lots of different structures that we need to tackle and change, and they somehow overlap in very uneventful everyday ways. So this problem of how to theorize the transition is addressed in the what I now call the Exodus model of change, in a sort of interesting mixture of optimism and pessimism. And one can maybe get at it if one takes the metaphor seriously and thinks about the Exodus, like the biblical story of Exodus of the Jews from Egypt. And the riddle of that story is that it actually only takes 3 days to go through the desert from to Canaan. Yet, according to the biblical narrative, they spent 40 years in the desert. And then lots of commentary has been done on that. And even though not like usually taken to be a rabbinic commentary, Marx himself notes makes a remark on that, where he says, quote, "The contemporary generation," so this time, "equals the Jews, which Moses led through the desert. It not only has a world to conquer, it also has to perish to make room for the people who match up to such a world." So there is this, Marx was aware that there's a problem of transition, and in this passage it's quite stunning that actually the solution is just get rid of all the old ones and wait for there to be new, and you wonder where they come from if there's sort of no overlap with the previous generation. So that reference to the Jewish people being led through the desert by Moses is no accident. And it invokes a key reference point for radical political thinking. So especially within the Jewish tradition and its notions of temporality that sort of unfolds outside this Christian eschatology that sort of since the birth of Christ, history is already underway, and that is reflected in certain ideas of dialectical philosophy of history. The motive of Exodus underwrites a different narrative of liberation. So what we do, however, with this extended period differs widely, and Marx is a very untypical commentator. So an interesting contrast to that is formed by the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, who interprets this delay, or the length of time it took, as follows, quote, "For a sudden change from one opposite to the other is impossible. The deity uses a merciful cunning when prompting the people to wander through the desert in confusion until their souls have become brave, and also until humans are born who had not been used to humiliation and servitude." So the emphasis on the impossibility of a sudden transition, as well as the appreciation of the time spent in the desert, likewise structures the position of a series of anarchist theorists from Proudhon and Kropotkin to Gustav Landauer and Martin Buber, who throughout the 19th century maintained a specific conception of radical change, and as I said, it's often developed in an overstated contrast to the Marxist alternative. As the richest and also most forgotten amongst these, Gustav Landauer is at the focus of what I present. He was a German Jew, journalist, writer, essayist, poet, translator, married to a quite famous poet, writer at the time. He's one of the few men I know of who made money by doing work in the name of his wife. So he did lots of translations and then put her name on because she was actually more famous for that. Yeah, so see, I'm just making him likable in all possible ways. The one thing that and he lived exactly the same time as the German Imperium, so the Kaiserreich, so 1871 to 1919. And unfortunately, mostly he's very iconically remembered for his death because he was kind of very brutally murdered at the destruction of the Munich Council Republic in 1919, which he had served as a Minister of Culture and Education. And his work is driven by very fierce polemics against this sort of belief in dialectical necessity in history. And he denounces it as bad magic. Because I have a few quotes now, whenever I do this, then somebody else is speaking. So the miracle in which the superstition of whichever denomination believes, the miracle assumed by materialism and mechanism, that the great will come without effort, and that the grown-up socialism will not come from the childlike beginnings of socialism, but from the monstrosity of capitalism, this miracle will not arrive, and soon enough people will not even know the belief in it anymore. Destroying that belief in the miracle, however, for him, so you could think then we're left with no hope, like that's sort of let's mourn that wrong concept of revolution, but instead he maintains a certain hope for a socialist future, and interestingly assigns that future a place already in the present. So quote again, "We do not wait for the revolution, for socialism to start thereafter, but we start to turn socialism real, so that the great change will come through it. Not the least has been done for socialism yet. Nothing of it has been done. What do you want to fight and let yourselves be killed for?" And so Landauer's perspective, also in that invocation, means that he's thoroughly skeptic towards premature revolutions, whose success he doubted as long as the revolutionary subject itself wouldn't already be of a post-revolutionary condition. So in the same vein, Landauer's friend and disciple Martin Buber attests the tragedy of revolutions whose results do not precede the struggle. Their tragedy is that as regards their positive goals, of the revolutions, they will always result in the exact opposite of what the most honest and passionate revolutionaries strive for, unless and until this deep social reform has so far taken shape before the revolution, that the revolutionary act has only to wrest the space for it in which it can develop unimpeded. I think that's a kind of beautiful quotation that summarizes the position, but also shows the proximity to historical materialism. Of course, Marx thought as well that all the conditions sort of need to be in place and you only wrest space for them in revolution. It's just that at least in some of his writing, he had a fairly one-sided focus on the economic organization. Also not everywhere. I mean, this whole idea about workers' coalitions is, I think, even more similar to here, that he thought we first need unions and then they're going to radicalize, and every sort of, all those intermediate steps help forming a class consciousness, and all that needs to be there before sort of we have the dictatorship of the proletariat. You need to have the collective sort of in shape before the event of transition. So against the notion of revolution as strategic, ballistic struggle, anarchist positions in particular postulate the congruency of means and ends, feminists as well. The repetition of authoritarian principles has to stop already during the fight, not just within the new society. Thus, according to the motive of Exodus, the revolutionary period gets extended over a long preparatory phase within which the new utopian practices, with great labor, Landauer says, have to be decentrally established and perpetually rehearsed. Freedom, Landauer states, cannot be created. It has to be collectively practiced. And he really says that, it's not just because I read before. And I mean, there's also like the whole Hegelian tradition of social freedom as being something that needs to be embodied in institutions that are actually out there and collectively inhabited is kind of interestingly there, but not in a sort of justification of the given state, but in the anticipation of a possible future arrangement. So be it land communes or urban collectives, soup kitchens, free academies, cooperatives, all of those figure as anticipations of the hope for change, as laboratories for future forms of sociality. The revolution in this picture is instantiated by a sort of growing coalition of coalitions. He says Bund der Bünde. That sort of sounds better in German because Bund is also covenant, so that gives us, like, refers back to the sort of Exodus thing. Spreading from marginal sites. In the lexicon of the sociologist and analytical Marxist Eric Olin Wright, this type of social transformation can be called interstitial change. So the term interstitial is very appropriate because it doesn't only mean taking place in the gaps, so interstitials are the sort of gaps between something, the existing order, but interstitial also means creating the gaps, sort of widening them. And of course the fantasy is one day that will be the new core. That's precisely the ambivalence the conception would have to live up to. And you can sort of turn it around into a really serious question addressed at it. Is it possible to account for that nexus between interstitial or marginality and the potential for social transformation? I mean, why would the interstitial actually affect the whole? Like, that's an open question. And under which, or why, or maybe better, under which conditions can marginal, even utopian alternatives actually transform the structures of a society? So it's all good to say that it's slowly, but it might also like be infinite or never happening. So that's what my whole PhD was about, and I came out of it nearly as a reconstructed historical materialist. But for today, I actually want to focus on a different question. I'm just saying that, I mean, I'm aware that like there's no inbuilt guarantee for success. Like that would be an absurd theory. Hardly anybody holds it, and it's always attributed to the camp that you don't like. Like they are so naive, they think if you have good examples and everything will fall in place. Like, of course not. But sometimes it works, but a lot needs to be in place for that to happen. Anyway, there is also another really pressing paradox. If revolution on the large scale is supposedly impossible because people lack the agency to cooperate according to the new patterns and will always fall back in the old authoritarianism, and if they're sort of unable to leave behind their received identities, and then we have this tragedy of the revolution as Buber had it, then why would it not be just as impossible on the small scale, in little enclaves? I mean, it's the same people, right? So where should the agency come from, even on the local level? Why should that be any easier or any better? Why, like, even for those anticipatory small-scale interstices to have a desirable form, there needs to be some capacity to, like, form different practices. And that's now the moment where I want to sketch in a bit more detail what I take to be partial answers, which both Landauer, who of course meant to address that question, and Butler, whom I kind of hijacked to do it, formulate or propose. So the first question, as I just said, raised by this Exodus account is brought about precisely by the strength. So it critiques the unlikelihood of a sudden transition, but if, as also Landauer himself highlights already towards the end of the 19th century, I mean, that's so amazing, right? They said that all before there was no Russian Revolution, let alone any Stalinism, and there was already that kind of theorizing. So, I mean, I don't know. I do find it impressive. Especially because everybody calls those people like always very naive, but like within the German public sphere, that's really the only people who were proven right. Like he also very much predicted the First World War. Anyway, the subjectivities and scope for action, even of the revolutionaries themselves, are limited by the habits of the existing order. This dilemma of transition remains acute even on the small scale. How would the subjects currently living in alienation and isolation even form coalitions? How would they be able to sustain small alliances? How would they foster shared utopian practices? Interestingly, in the society that Landauer founded, the Socialist Bund, that was his tool to promote this Landkommune movement, one could only sign up as a member collectively. So you couldn't become a member as a person, you needed to become a member as an affinity group. It's interesting, actually, ACT UP was organized in the same way. I don't think anybody knew that. But then again, from where should the motivation and capacity spring for those kinds of collectivity? The peculiar solution that Landauer suggested served a great deal to discredit, sometimes also hail, him as a mystic. And that, I think, this sort of labels almost as hindering of the reception of his work as the halo of the martyr, which fixes most attention to his person because of dramatic death rather than to his writing. So in his talk, this is one of the few things that is translated to English, in his talk, Durch Absonderung zur Gemeinschaft, so to community via isolation, Landauer sets out precisely with a situation of extreme individualization and maintains the claim that via introspection, so via a reflection or perhaps meditation on our irrecoverable conditions of existence, we can nevertheless assure ourselves of an undeniable collectivity. He puts it in that way: when we thoroughly isolate ourselves, when we as individuals drown deepest into ourselves, sort of very funny, like you drown in the sea, right? But you drown in yourself, then we find eventually in the innermost core of our being the oldest and most general community. That was humankind and the universe. It gets slightly less weird, let's see. Landauer speaks in this context of the Aufgabe des Individuums, which in German, Aufgabe means both task, but also the giving up of the individual. So I'm ambivalent in that way. It's very interesting because at the time he wrote that, there was very wide reception of Nietzsche, and the self-creation of the individual was what everybody was talking about, like expressionism. Also, there was a lot of the Stirner-inspired anarchism. They had exactly the opposite agenda, and he coined this term of the Aufgabe of the individual. And via this task of giving up oneself, the realization of a more fundamental connectedness was supposed to emerge. If we approach the world from the outside, we see, feel, smell, hear, and taste individuals. But if we rest with ourselves, then we might arrive at surpassing the autonomous individual feeling. What we are our ancestors inside us. It is an immense chain reaching from infinity to infinity, because our works as well, whatever we effect, are, as long as we live, parts connecting us with the universe. A resonance that might come to mind here is the phrase of Walter Benjamin, himself a reader of Landauer: then we have been evaded on earth. Then, like to every generation before us, the weak messianic power has been passed on to us, on which the past has a claim. So that was Benjamin. For Landauer, however, the immediate claim of the past is for us to revise our individualistic understanding of ourselves. Landauer tries to prompt the collectivization of the individual via a reflection very similar to the one used by Kropotkin in order to deconstruct patent right. It's also not a coincidence because Landauer was the German translator of Kropotkin, and he translated him very loosely and also then reused lots of those things which he had anyway made up in his own writing without attributing them to Kropotkin. So it was, anyway, the whole point is to destroy copyright here. So in his Conquest of Bread, Kropotkin uses the following description to unsettle the notion of any such thing as an original invention or an original idea. And I think it's really beautiful, so I'm going to again read you a longer quote. There is nothing, be it a thought or an invention, that wouldn't be collective work. There's nothing that wouldn't have its origin in past and future alike. Thousands of inventors, known or unknown, dying in misery, have prepared the invention of those machines in which the man of the day admires his genius. Thousands of philosophers, scholars, inventors have themselves only been inspired by the work of past centuries. Have they not been fed and sustained throughout their lives, in physical and spiritual respects, by legions of workers and tradesmen of all sorts? Did they not bail their driving force from the whole environment? So unquote. In the same way in which technical achievements are here declared to be commons, never, if you think about it for more than 1 second, never attributable to any one individual, in the same way Landauer's appeal that collective processes constitute individuals suggests their socialization. And it's not just the ancestry in us that leads to an ever more dispersed collective. Any cultural technique we appropriate is the outcome of a shared practice. It is always already owed to community and could be traced back to an infinite plurality. And it's interesting because, of course, that's also an idea of the sort of materialized labor, as you would have it in Marxist terms, but it then refers it back to the plurality of those who actually did that work and sort of uses that to destroy the idea of one unit you could attribute it to. Nevertheless, the force of Landauer's drowning oneself in oneself seems of limited impact. Even if one found this collectivity of the bottom of oneself, so even if we buy this sort of somewhat esoteric stuff of you only have to reflect in the right way, then you will have that insight and you realize you are disowned, you are not like a sovereign individual, even if that worked, then the practical isolation wouldn't necessarily be undone by the end of the meditation. So there still is no actual community, right? It is still sort of dispossessed but separate individuals. It's still open what there is to be done with the dispossessed self. And I think it's here that maybe the comparison with a different, temporary, much more familiar notion of the dispossessed self is instructive, because like Butler comes at it from a different angle or dimension that leaves us slightly less alone. Though as I'm going to say in the end, in certain ways more lost than more. As one of the key terms in her recent work, Judith Butler, well, it's not so recent anymore, anyway, in the last 12 years, Butler uses the concept of being undone, initially with a focus on sexuality, then expanding into a theory of the subject. Butler explores how we, thanks to fundamental precariousness, are not just all fixed and frozen in our various locations and subject positions, but tied to one another. It is by each other, then, that we are undone. Besides Levinas's motive of exposure, it is the psychoanalytical concept of transference, so as theorized by Laplanche, along the lines of which Butler develops her ecstatic understanding of the subject. And I think that's not precisely a new conception of the subject, because at least the way Butler reads Hegel, then like subjects have been ecstatic all along, but definitely she puts the heaviest weight on that, or stresses this aspect most. So in transference, as described in psychoanalysis, or psychoanalytic theory, the unconscious projects past emotional states onto a current counterpart, who thereby is assigned a place in the restaging of someone else's history. By way of this repetition, one receives back one's story in an altered form, as one's own constellation and fantasy scenario is affected by the reaction of the other, whom one had involved in it. Butler suggests to expand this specific situation outside the psychoanalytical exchange and understand it in principle as that what happens in any address or in any encounter. And so the more it resonates with the unconscious, the stronger. Transference is a paradigm case of how Butler understands being undone or dispossession. A special the areas allegedly most proper to the self, so sex, gender, sexuality, are on the one hand gateways for alterity and transformation, and can on the other hand themselves be exposed to reconfiguration in a respective scene of address. It's like Butler never quotes her much, but Teresa de Laurete's famous claim that it takes two women to be a lesbian, like that's sort of one of those ideas that you can be affected in those domains, but it always takes the address or the encounter. It's not something you can do introspectively or by yourself, changing your, in that case, sexuality. I might assume my gender and my sexuality, and yet be time and again put outside myself, besides myself, by the power of that encounter. One does not always stay intact, says Butler, and proceeds, it may be that one wants to, or does, but it may also be that despite one's best efforts, one is undone, in the face of the other, by the touch, by the scent, by the feel, by the prospect of the touch, by the memory of the feel. Faced with this prehistory and the irreducible entanglement of our identity's aspects with those of others, Butler concludes by redescribing identity, or rather by replacing it. Quote, so when we speak about my sexuality or my gender, as we do and as we must, we mean something complicated by it. Neither of these is precisely a possession, but both are to be understood as modes of being dispossessed, ways of being for another, or indeed by virtue of another. Modes of dispossession are not something we could claim ownership or copyright for. Butler's theory of the subject is not just one of socialization, so we become who we are by the influences from others, but one of collectivization. So in German you can make a difference, like it's Sozialisation versus Sozialisierung. So Sozialisierung is when you collectivize something, you really put it into common ownership. Subjects are not only in the hands of others, they belong there. They are commons produced in infinite co-authorship. And the reference to authorship is no accident here. Just as Landauer's idea of overcoming the sovereign individual feed on Kropotkin's refutation of patent law, Butler is writing in the vein of Foucault's famous essay, What is an Author? However, what she loses in her focus on recognition, despite many assertions to the contrary, is the firm grip Landauer had on the fact that it's actual materialized labor, works, and deeds, and care that sustain us all the way down, and not just normative frames. Yet, as against Landauer's diachronic, so historical commemoration, Butler's version has the crucial advantage of revealing and establishing actual, sort of synchronic entanglements and alliances with others. We are already constantly undone. We only have to face this. So those reflections might dispel the initial worry that there are simply no patterns, no dimensions of experience on which the required community building might be based. So there seem to be at least traces in those two accounts of what that might mean, a community of the dispossessed, or why dispossession might even be a precondition for community, but also a vehicle for it. Like dispossession already takes you there. Like once you're done with the dispossession, you're already sort of more collective. That's the promise. Like we are already constantly undone, we only have to face it. So that might dispel the worry, that there are no patterns. So there's something. But also, it is only that. It is only a possibility. And again, sort of Wendy Brown has highlighted in her work that crumbling sovereignty, so sort of could be described as a way of dispossession, both on the level of states and individuals, doesn't necessarily lead to admitting vulnerability and sort of affirming shared belonging. It can also lead to erecting walls and sort of emphasizing whatever phantom sovereignty you have like at your disposal. So I think even though we have now added some layers, surprisingly. It's not as if we can just sort of close the book on here's your way to the community of the dispossessed. But I think what is important alongside this rather like utopian reflection of what could community building be like, what could those anticipatory moments look like, one also needs to try as best as one can to understand the bad alternative, sort of the structure of the given, so that we know what we are grappling with or what sort of provides a resistance to our attempts at self-dispossession. And what I want to suggest here, in Skype, because I still have 5 minutes and I am or do I not?
You have
Okay, 10 minutes. Oh, I'm going to talk so slow then. No, that's good. I have 10 minutes. I believe I can give long answers in the discussion. There's no shortage of me talking ever. So what I think is important to also get into view is that there is something that in critical theory you would call a temporal core. So in German, the Zeitkern. Landauer says, die Wahrheit hat einen Zeitkern, like truth always has a temporal core. There is a sort of particular reason why dispossession might be an adequate or a focal point of looking for overcoming our type of non-collectivity towards a more solidaric collectivity. And I think it's actually, so this use of dispossession correlates with a certain ideology we are living in, namely that of privatization. And I'm going to say more what I mean by that a bit more. So dispossession is more than a metaphor. So in fact, I want to claim it's not a metaphor at all. It's already a hint at a certain social analysis. We really are actually, we have to grapple with a certain like structure of property, possessiveness. Of course, there's already like well-known work on this, most famously McPherson's analysis of possessive individualism as like the paradigm for modern autonomy and self-understanding. And Butler and Athena Athanasio in this kind of little book that's also called Dispossessions repeatedly also refer to McPherson in their exchange. That leads them then to not wanting to dispossess the individual per se, but asking for, quote, a dispossession of the ontology of possessive individualism. So actually, what we want to actually now we're dealing with dispossessing a certain paradigm rather than the individual people. And I think, again, dispossession only is a counter strategy because possession is, to a certain extent, the form that power takes. But what exactly is that form of possessive individualism? As described by McPherson, it is the understanding of autonomy premised upon ownership and in extension to that, self-ownership. Orlando Patterson has then pointed out that this idea of sort of autonomy qua self-ownership and ownership could only ever crystallize against the palpable example of people really not owning themselves, i.e. in the context of slavery. So possessive individualism, the reasoning goes, always needs some others reduced to the status of object owned. So it already then sort of describes the social arrangement and not just the sort of self-understanding of autonomy. There's also a symbolic level to self-ownership, which is performed in self-control. As Adriana puts it in her paper, quote, possession referring not only to property, but also to the resultant imaginary right to define and proclaim a person's humanity in proportion to her possession of herself. And I mean, that formulation already implies that it is always sort of the others who define whether someone counts as self-possessed, and that often has then disastrous consequences for those to whom that status is denied, more often than not. Rebellious or treacherous women, for example, were then told that like you don't even possess yourself, therefore we are allowed of taking control. And additionally, what I would like to suggest is that we complement the logics of possession, so that's all those things one can do in trying to like explain social relations in terms of the role possession plays in them, with what I would like to call the logic of propertization. Propertization, that's it's kind of used in a very sort of thorough and boring social history, is the process of an object being subsumed under the property form. And more often, it can also be a relation being hijacked by property logics, and thereby in the first place objectified. And I mean, you can think of agriculture in a way that that's just lots of practices that have to do with material surroundings and your own body and like traditional knowledge, without ever even thinking about you as a farmer and the land as an object you own. Like, it's not necessary to split that up into those poles. And that already kind of brings me to the next point I want to make. It's important to understand that along with this privatization, there goes a shift in the property form as such. So there's nothing like a timeless logic of possession and then that gets somehow expanded and more things are covered by this logic of ownership. So lots of things weren't property, and then sort of come modernity, colonialism, and early capitalism, they were property. It's more that a new and sort of radicalized understanding of property gets established precisely while it is extending its domain. So in the same historical process in which sort of more things are addressed as property that haven't been so understood before, also the meaning of what property entitles you to changes. And there's really awesome, that sounds like just some grandiose claim, but there's very detailed, very interesting scholarship on that. So I don't know whether you know Brenna Bandar. You should invite her. She's awesome, from London, from SOAS. She's worked a lot on property and race and also like settler colonialism, and has those really detailed accounts of how the pre-modern idea of property in England, which had a lot to do with narration and tradition. And so, for example, you can't just buy and sell a piece of land. If you do that, one has to assemble all the documents, all the objects, all the sort of ritual anecdotes that have been attached to that piece of land by previous owners. So then you have this big heap of different kind of like sheets of paper from different times and lots of forms, and it's a whole sort of circus that you need to do to hand over land from one person to another. And then there was colonial conquest, and they tried out a regime there which we now find the totally normal logical way to do that. There's a property register, that there's something as a centralized map of there are those pieces of land, and you write in who it belongs to, and if you transfer it, then you just sort of cross out the name and put another there, and there's no ritual around it, and there's not lots of peculiar rights that attach to that piece of land. And so then that was tried out as with so many things, tried out in the colony and then brought back to England itself and like sold as the efficient way. And that was really sort of in the 17th century, the shift from feudal pre-modern understanding of ownership to this much more bureaucratic, administrative idea of ownership that you couldn't even have done if a sort of less unified feudal property imaginary had persisted. It was only because the feudal relations were, for every little piece of land, there are different rights of who can bring their cows through and who had a house there that burned down 100 years ago, but if their grandchildren want to build it again, then they can, and all those kind of like tissus and lions. I don't even know the English words for that because it's sort of not in my modern vocabulary, but like all those feudal entitlements and serviences, like that was extracted from the land, and it was seen as just an object that you can then transfer to another. So that's just to give you an idea that in that process, then of course it also changes the meaning of what owning is, because it becomes, and I mean that's also been described often, it becomes a much more absolute or sovereign relation over an object much more clearly defined. So for one thing, it also presumes fixed boundaries of the object. So if your property, if owning something really means you can exclude all others from it, and it's not just that you have the responsibility for this castle because the king gave it to your grandfather, but you're not allowed to burn it down, and you also don't really know where your land ends and starts, and sometimes you put a fence up and sometimes not, depending on your mood. Like in the modern understanding of property, the first thing is to, like as we have in the enclosures, is to know where the object begins and ends. The other thing that the modern property form presumes is that as part of this absolute dominion, you can not only use and enjoy what you own, but you can really do what you want with it. So it extends the rights you have over the things. So for example, with the feudal castle, you can't burn it down. Like even if your family has lived in it for 500 years, you're not allowed to destroy it because it's somehow the king's, and the king got it from God, and so it has a sort of different status. Whereas we are very used to the fact that I can break this pen. I mean, you might think it's ridiculous, but that's what it means that I own it. Like I have a right to also destroy it. So in question of doubt, then the and linchpin of property is this right to abuse. So it's like somehow Latinized. So use abutendi. Interestingly, it was not part of Roman law, at least not explicitly. So it was invented. Well, that's a long story how it was invented.
I lost the sense. I'm not
Great, yeah. I mean, anyway, I want to.
Can you just repeat it?
I think I know where.
What did not exist in the Roman law?
The idea, yeah, it was because I had this badly pronounced Latin word in there. So the use abutendi. So if you break down property law in several laws, so it's the law, it's the right to exclude, and it's the right to use something, it's the right to alienate it, and then crucially for the modern property form, it's also the right to abuse it. Like you can destroy it, you can also do random violence to it, and then in Latin that's called use, so for right, abutendi, so abuse, like right to abuse. And it's interesting that sort of in the process of formulating that, and it was also, for example, part of the Code Napoleon, it was always Latinized, but you do not find it in Roman law. So there's always the fantasy of Prudence, of like claims that was in Roman law, but I mean, it's just not true. Like scholarship has shown that it was somewhat of a genuine modern invention. Okay, that's all a bit nerdy. So the what I just wanted to get at is that the linchpin of property therefore is violence. So making use, in the question of doubt, you can establish or demonstrate to the world that you really have that claim over the object by performing your entitlement to abuse or destroy it. And Adriana also makes an interesting link in her paper between the logic of property and precisely such a propensity to violence. So she says the continuum of violence is necessary for the logic of ownership to remain the only valid logic, the logic used to defend one's own inviolability and to justify the destruction of others, for example in war or other legally conducted violence. And I think this is not only a dynamic of destroying the enemy and defending one's boundary, because there is already presupposed an understanding of our own identities and our own belongings as propertized, as taking the form of property, and that already sort of purporting with them a right to abuse and destructiveness. So then an emancipatory prospect would not only be dispossession, but somehow depropertization. Because if we leave the form of property intact, sort of just subtracted, then whether or not one person owns a house or many own it collectively, or whether one state or the international community have territorial sovereignty, that would not really be a remedy and would not make the crucial difference. But the propertizing, so replacing rule and reification with care and relationality, might be a sort of more promising interstitial practice. So now, like, what would it even mean to depropertize? And I'm not going to fully resolve that riddle. But I think one thing that's clear is that unlike dispossession that I spend most time talking about, it cannot be done by introspection or intersubjectivity alone. So you, in some sense, then the Landauer and the Butler is not, even though they point to the right direction, is not enough, because you actually do need objects. Like, it's a different way of relating to and having stewardship over object. So you do need them, you just need to handle them differently.